That's the shadow in action. It finds ways to confirm itself. It makes you look for the evidence. And sometimes it makes you behave in ways that create the very outcome you fear. Hi everyone, I'm Lisa, and welcome back to Self-Awareness Sucks. Before we get into it, I just want to say I'm not a psychologist, a therapist, or a medical professional, and I'm not claiming to be, and I'm not here to give advice or a diagnosis. Everything I share on this podcast is based on my own experiences, thoughts, and observations, so please take what resonates, leave what doesn't, and if you are struggling with anything I mention, please do reach out to a qualified professional or at least someone you trust. And before we get into the episode itself, I just want to give a specific couple of notes. Firstly, I'm going to be touching on some things that also came up in episode 7, namely body image, bullying, and fitness. So if any of those topics feel like too much today, please do take care of yourself first. You can come back when you're ready, or skip this one entirely. Either way, I'll still be here. And secondly, throughout this episode, I'm going to reference some psychological and literary concepts. Just Carl Jung, post-colonial theory, and a few others. But I've only done very basic foundational research into these, so I'm not an expert or an academic, and as I've said, I'm not claiming to be. These have just helped shape how I understand my own experiences, and I found these frameworks, and I want to share them in case they do the same for you, in case they can help you as well. So, let's get into it. You might be reading the title and thinking, what on earth is the shadow self? And I want to start by saying that I came to this concept through astrology and tarot, which I think I've mentioned a couple of times across the series. And whether you're into that or not, I think that what I'm going to talk about today will resonate regardless, because underneath the spiritual framing, shadow work is actually one of the most practical and psychologically grounded things I've ever come across. The term itself originates with Carl Jung, the Swiss psychiatrist and psychoanalyst. He described the shadow as the unconscious part of the personality, the parts of ourselves we repress, deny, or hide because they don't fit the versions of ourselves we want to present to the world. And shadow work is the process of bringing those hidden parts into the light, of naming them, of understanding where they came from, and deciding what to do with them. And here's the thing about naming. There's actually a psychological concept called affect labeling, which is the idea that when you put a name to an emotion or experience, it reduces its power over you, because your brain can struggle with the unnamed and may even spiral into the unknown. So when something gets a name, whether that's through a medical diagnosis, a conversation, a book, a tarot card, or just finding the right word for something you've been carrying, something shifts and becomes workable. And you might even be able to look at it directly instead of circling around it in the dark. And that's exactly what shadow work did for me. It gave me language for things I'd been experiencing for years without really being able to articulate. So as I said, I discovered the phrase through spirituality, specifically tarot and astrology. And I want to be honest about that because I know it's not everyone's world, but whether you believe tarot cards are guided by something external or whether you think it's just your subconscious telling you a story, the function is the same. You're sitting with yourself, you're asking uncomfortable questions, and sometimes you get what I can only describe as a slap in the face. A brutal, honest reflection of exactly where you are and what you've been avoiding. And I've had a lot of these moments over the years. Some of the things I've already talked about across this series, the white lies, the all or nothing pattern, the fear of being perceived. Those were all shadow work in practice, even before I had the language for it. So let me tell you what it actually looked like for me. Rewind to September 2023. At the time, I remember thinking, I am fed up of being this person. This person who's in pain, who doesn't feel confident, who doesn't feel healthy. But in reality, I'd also been in a job that I was really unhappy with. I was working fully remotely, with a relatively unhealthy diet, and had become pretty, if not completely sedentary. I really didn't move around much, and because I was so unmotivated by the work, I didn't then feel motivated to exercise or do anything. So I have to give myself some grace. But simultaneously, I was secretly hoping that something would magically happen and sort itself out. I'd forgotten about my phrase that had come to me a couple of years prior. And as I've said, that's never the case. These things don't just happen. And finally, that phrase came back around. No one is coming to fix this for me. I have to actually do something. So I did. I locked in and I started taking it seriously. And this all happened within a week, I'm pretty sure. I booked in an appointment at a nutrition club and had a body composition scan where they look at your body fat percentage and muscle mass and all those kinds of things. And it was a huge wake-up call for me that I really needed, because I'd become far more unhealthy than I realised, and far more unhealthy than I'd ever wanted to. But at the same time, I'd also finally booked in to see an osteopath and had a physiotherapy appointment for a shoulder injury I'd been ignoring since 2019. So it was all happening at once, all these 3 appointments happening in the span of 7 days. And I felt really good. I felt really motivated. I felt like I was finally getting control. But here's what I didn't realise at the time. And it was that I had a shadow belief running underneath all of it. And one that I've mentioned before, which was this story that I told myself for years about how I'm someone who doesn't exercise, and that I say the phrase, and I would say the phrase, I don't exercise. And that it was just a fixed fact about who I was. And it took me a while to see it for what it was. Not a fact, but a belief. And one that I'd constructed entirely on my own. But also one that I could actually change. But to understand where that belief came from, I have to go back much, much further. Because shadow beliefs don't appear from nowhere. They're built slowly over years. And mine started long before September 2023. I mentioned this before as well, but I was bullied at school. Pretty much every day for years. Called fat, called ugly, called weird. And the thing about being bullied consistently for long enough is that eventually you start to believe it. Not consciously. You don't sit down and decide, yes, these people are right about me. This is exactly who I am. It happens more subtly than that. It seeps in and creates a foundation for future beliefs. And a couple of years after leaving school, I did something that I think was, in retrospect, one of the earliest pieces of shadow work I ever did without knowing it. I confronted my bully at a party, of all things. It was wild. I think I just sat down next to him and just asked him directly, no preamble or anything. I just went, why? Why me? Why did you bully me? And he said, because you were an easy target. And I didn't really have an answer at the time, but it did partly give me closure. At the same time, it was also very vague, because it had nothing to do with me and everything to do with him. And I think I've been sitting with it ever since without ever really fully addressing it. It's one of those things I've been subtly working on in lots of different ways. But maybe it's still something that I've got to work on. But what I can say is this. Contrastingly, I've been called intimidating by some people in recent years. Which, if you told the version of me who was being called fat and ugly every day, she would not have believed you. But somewhere along the way, I stopped making myself small enough to be this easy target. I started standing my ground, and I started even rebuking things that weren't okay rather than absorbing them. And that's not nothing. Even if I haven't consciously sat down and done the work on that specific thing, something shifted. But back then in school, I needed something to hold on to. Something that made me feel interesting in a way that wasn't a reason to be targeted and that couldn't be called weird or ugly. And that something was my heritage. Now, I have quite an unusual, perhaps even remarkable origin story. Or at least it made me feel remarkable, which I think is the more honest thing to say. My mum grew up in Tajikistan, a country that most people, when I've mentioned it to them, have never heard of and couldn't place on a map. And she lived through the Soviet Union. Whereas my dad grew up in England, served in the army, and did bomb disposal of all things. And then he ended up in Tajikistan and met my mum through work. And that work just so happened to be on a gold mining site. I know, it's wild. But I'm so used to it that it doesn't really impact me when I say this story, when I hear it. So I grew up in the UK as the product of all of that. Half Russian, half English, and speaking both languages fluently at home, and having family traditions and food and ways of living that looked completely different to what my friends had in their homes. And yet looking exactly like everyone else on the outside. From what I can remember, I was one of few people in my school who spoke another language. Now, I might be wrong, but again, that's just what I can remember because it was a while ago now. And I had this whole other world inside my home that nobody could see from the outside. And the thing is, my heritage never made me a target. It was never the reason for my bullying. If anything, it almost counterbalanced what I was being bullied for. And it became my cushion, my safety net. Because it made me interesting rather than, for want of a better word, an outcast. In primary school, I remember we had a culture celebration week, and I remember being asked to wear my traditional Russian dress and talk about the food and the culture to all of the classes in my year. And then in high school, I gave a tour of the school to teachers from Kazakhstan because they didn't speak English and they needed a translator. So for me, it was something, and it felt like something really vital. But I never really fully understood why I always felt a bit different beyond that. And then I went to university and we studied post-colonial theory and post-colonial literature as one of our modules. And we studied concepts like exoticism and double identity, which if memory serves, from what I can remember, is the experience of being perceived as other even when you appear the same, of carrying a culture that's invisible to the people around you. And when I encountered those frameworks, something finally clicked into place. I suddenly had language for something I'd been carrying my whole life without being able to name it. And as I've said throughout, naming things changes everything. But here's where it gets harder to admit. As I got older, my heritage became less distinctive. University had thousands of people, and there were intercultural societies that I could have joined and never did. this is just something to remember for later on in the episode. And more people I met were mixed race, multilingual, or had similar intercultural experiences to mine. So the world got bigger, and what had made me feel special in a small school started to matter less. And even now, nobody asks anymore, not really. And when they do, it tends to be in the context of stereotypes, which, for me personally, feels like it reduces something rich and personal and formative to a cliche, which kind of feels like its own erasure. And when I do bring it up, my heritage, my Russian speaking, anything to do with it, and to be honest, I probably bring it up more than I need to, it feels quite forced and awkward sometimes. Because for so long, everyone around me just knew. It was part of how people understood me without me having to explain it. And now, in rooms full of people who don't have that context, I find myself reaching for it, dropping it into conversations and even looking for opportunities to bring it up. Which, if I'm honest, looking back on some of those moments, there was no need for that, and it makes me cringe a little bit, actually. But as I talked about in episode 5, cringe isn't necessarily a bad thing. It's just something interesting to notice. But the reason I reach for it is the same reason I always have. It's the one thing that's always made me feel special. And letting go of that, or at least loosening my grip on it, is its own piece of work. But I do catch myself feeling almost proprietary when Russia comes up in a TV show or a film. I almost want people to come to me as the authority, the authenticator, the person who can verify whether an accent is right or a portrayal is honest. I want them to look at me as the expert, even though, admittedly, I don't know as much as I could. And the honest truth is that nobody needs a Russian speaker in the way they once might have. So nobody asks. And as interesting as I think my background might be, unless I bring it up, it doesn't come up. And I catch myself feeling almost jealous when other people talk about their own heritage. This wanting of ownership, of stake, of claim bubbles up inside of me. And I've sat with that feeling for a while now, and I think what it is, underneath the jealousy, underneath the forcing it into conversations, is grief. The thing that made me feel remarkable stopped working. And if the underlying belief running through everything is, I need to be remarkable to be worth noticing, losing your primary source of remarkability is a specific kind of loss that I don't think I've fully processed. Because that belief, I need to be remarkable to be worth noticing, has been there for a long time. Probably since school. I just didn't have a name for it until recently. And I actually visualised remarkability a bit like a section on a Wikipedia page. Like, if someone were to read an article about your life, what would make them stop and go, oh wow, this person did this and this and this, that's incredible. And that's who I wanted to be. And I'd measure everything against that invisible standard. So for the purposes of this episode, I'll refer to it as the Wikipedia belief. And what's interesting is that it was so embedded in me that I didn't notice it as a belief at all. It just felt like reality, like the obvious way to move through the world. And it took other people naming it externally, in videos and passing and conversations, for me to realise that it was a pattern rather than a fact. And I think that's because I grew up with it already installed. It didn't come to me as an idea I adopted. Instead, it arrived as a condition of the environment I was in. And nowadays, it feels like there's a whole culture that reinforces it. The pressure to have a personal brand, to have a niche, to have a story, to be doing something impressive, and to be remarkable, to be extraordinary. And it's ambient and constant in a way it wasn't before. And for those of us who already had that belief baked in, it just turns the volume up. But on the flip side of that belief, the shadow version of it, was this narrative I started telling myself, particularly after finishing university. And it was that I was just perfectly mid at everything. And at that point in my life, grades felt like everything. This was around the end of uni, the final year, I think. Because grades were how you measured your worth and your intelligence and your potential. And throughout uni, mine always sat at around 64 or 65, right in the middle. And this felt even worse after studying abroad in Australia, where because the boundaries were completely different, I was getting 70s and 80s. So coming back to my home university after that and only getting mid-60s felt like a real blow to the confidence that I had. And so for some bizarre reason, I started applying that same lens to everything else, my hobbies and my interests and my skills. And I was using those perfectly mid grades as confirmation bias across all of it. If I wasn't exceptional academically, maybe I wasn't exceptional at anything. And it's so sad to hear that out loud, even for myself. And at that time, I'd latched onto the phrase, jack of all trades, master of none. And I let it genuinely poison how I thought about myself, because it confirmed what the Wikipedia belief was already whispering. That being good at things wasn't enough. That competence without excellence was just another way of being unremarkable. And none of that was or is true. But I'd constructed the case so carefully and practiced it so consistently that it felt like fact. The irony is, to pull myself out of that narrative, I had to have confidence, and it required confidence that I didn't fully have yet. Because I'd have people tell me the opposite all the time, and yet I just didn't believe it. I would brush it off through humour or sarcasm, because external validation wasn't enough for me, because the belief was internal. So I had to confront it myself. I had to actively seek confirmation bias in the opposite direction and look for the evidence that I was good at things and that I was capable and that competence in many areas was its own kind of strength, rather than a failure to specialise. And gradually, I've come to a place where I've just accepted I'm good at things in my own way, which is very simple to say out loud, but the active acceptance of that has helped me grow my confidence in knowing that I don't have to be 100% at everything, and that I can have lots of skills without being a master of any of them. And that actually, you don't have to be a master or a specialist in anything. And that was never the point. So I've actually got a quote on my wall now, as cheesy as it might sound, but I do love something nice and poetic to look at and read. And it says, "It is of no use to anyone to be ashamed of yourself." And I think about it a lot, because shame isn't serving me, and it certainly isn't serving anyone else either. Constantly putting yourself down doesn't actually, I think, make you more humble or more likable or more worthy of sympathy. I think it actually just keeps you stuck. And this doesn't just pertain to how you see your abilities or your achievements. I think it applies to who you are as a person, your identity, your sexuality, your beliefs. Whatever it is that you've been made to feel ashamed of simply for existing a certain way. It's Pride Month as I'm recording this, and I saw a quote only a few days ago that really stayed with me. Like I said, I love a quote, but this one was, "Pride matters because somewhere out there are people who believe they'd be better off dead than be queer." And I'm not trying to dilute that in any way, but that's a weight of shame when it goes unchallenged. That's what it can do to a person when they're never given the language or the space or the safety to say, "This is who I am, and I don't have to be ashamed of it." And I want to say, I'm not gay, so I can't speak from that experience. I don't know what it feels like, and I would never claim to. But this point about shame, I think, can be universal enough that it feels important to say. Because whether shame is about your abilities or your taste in music or books or whatever, or your heritage or your identity, the damage it does is the same. And I didn't want to talk about shame without acknowledging that for some people, the stakes are so much higher than they've ever been for me. So when I say it is of no use to anyone to be ashamed of yourself, I mean that in the broadest possible sense. Not just the grade you got or the music you like or the skills you haven't mastered, but the fundamental things, the things that make you who you are. With the caveat, and I've said this before in this series, in episode 4 specifically, as long as you're not hurting anyone. That's always the line. Shame about who you are is never warranted. But that's different from being unaccountable for choices that cause harm to others. Free will is reason enough to live as yourself. It's not a justification for anything else. But getting to that place of not being ashamed required calling myself out repeatedly. Telling myself, don't think about yourself that way, because what purpose is it serving? And that's shadow work too. Not just confronting the dark parts, but choosing deliberately not to live in them. Now that belief showed up everywhere. And this is where Jung's framework gets a bit uncomfortable. He suggested that the traits we most strongly judge or criticise in other people are often the very traits we haven't yet acknowledged in ourselves. That we project our shadow outward. We see in others what we can't bear to see in ourselves. And I'll give you an example. Now, I am not proud of this in any way, shape or form, but it's true. And the whole point of this podcast is honesty. And I will always start as I mean to go on. So this is it. And it's that I catch myself being judgmental about other people's appearance. I don't say it out loud, I never have, and I never would. But the thought is there sometimes. And I've had to sit with the fact that the things I've silently judged in others are the exact things that I've been judged for. They are the exact things I've judged myself for. And even some insecurities that I'm still carrying. Because that's just projection. I was just directing outward what I hadn't and haven't yet resolved inward. And it's one of the hardest confrontations in shadow work. Not just seeing a pattern in yourself, but realising you've been criticising others for the same thing. That you've been, in some moments, a hypocrite. And that the judgment you directed outward was really about something unresolved in you. And this is still something I'm working on. You know, I'm still very much on my fitness journey, and I'm still repairing my relationship with exercise. Because as I talked about in episode 7, I spent years exercising for external reasons, for other people's expectations, and I never enjoyed it. So untangling that has taken time. And as that relationship has started to repair, as I've stopped trying to control an idealised image of what I and everyone else should look like, the projection has softened. I catch myself doing it less. And when I do catch it, I redirect. Not harshly, more just like a bit of a correction. And I say to myself, that is not yours to judge. Let it go. And what's interesting is that releasing that judgment has actually made me more relaxed in my own body. Because I wasn't just judging others, I was projecting my own insecurities outward and then trying to control something that was never mine to control. And letting go of the judgment of others freed up something in me too. As I've said in the beginning, it doesn't happen overnight. And I still notice it, but it happens less. And that's the only honest measure of progress I have. The belief also showed up in the white lies I talked about in episode 2. And I want to connect those more explicitly now because I understand them better than I did then. Because I used white lies to change the narrative and to control how I came across so that I wouldn't be seen as badly, so that I wouldn't have to take responsibility for something I'd done or said or felt, and so that I could soften the version of me that people encountered and actually make it easier for them not to be harsh to me. Because being harshly judged was already something I knew, and I didn't want more of it. And so I avoided conflict for the same reason, because for me, conflict felt like being targeted, and it felt like being the easy target all over again. So I found ways to manage it and ways to stay safe within it rather than addressing it directly. And what I eventually taught myself was to pause. In moments of conflict or hard conversation, instead of having a knee-jerk reaction, which for me always ended in tears, in losing the thread, in not being able to finish the conversation, I started saying out loud to whoever it was that I was talking to, I'm just thinking about what I want to say. And I'd sit with whatever it was that they'd said, or however it was that they'd made me feel. And I think this came from something I'd learned during my master's, which was in intercultural business communications, where we'd learned about the idea that not everything translates, that context shapes meaning, that what someone says and what they mean and how it lands are 3 completely different things. And I started applying that not just to language, but to emotions and actions and relationships. So I would ask myself, what were they feeling when they said that? What was the context of our relationship? What was I doing that contributed to this? And could I invalidate their feelings, even if hearing them hurt? The answer was always no. I couldn't invalidate their feelings because that's their emotion. That's just genuinely how they've reacted to something that's happened. But I also couldn't invalidate myself. And holding both of those things at once, acknowledging someone else's experience while also standing my ground, is something I've had to actively learn and conquer, because it didn't come naturally. And even now, it still requires a lot of effort. And the other phrase I use sometimes in these debates or disagreements or whatever it is, I might say, I don't disagree with you, but what I'm also trying to say is this, and this is where it's coming from. Not to win, but just to stay present and to not shut down or explode or cry and lose the thread. Just to remain intentional. Sometimes, of course, I do disagree and I tell them that, but I'll always try and see it from their perspective. And this connects forward to a later episode about language and communication, so I'll come back to it properly then. But for now, what matters is this. Choosing not to react abruptly was itself a form of taking responsibility, because it meant staying in the room with something uncomfortable instead of escaping it. And there's another place this belief showed up that I only recently connected to this whole thread. And it's actually something I'm still unpacking. For a long time, and this goes back even further than the "don't be boring" comment I talked about in episode 6, I'd already convinced myself that people found me boring. Before anyone said it out loud, I'd actually constructed the narrative myself, and I'd completely forgotten about this when I recorded episode 6, so I want to bring it up now. And this sounds a bit random, but part of it was about music. Because music has always felt like a core part of identity to me. And for years, I genuinely didn't know how to answer the question, oh, what music do you like? Who's your favourite musician? What's your favourite album? I'd freeze and I'd give answers that weren't really true just to have something to say. I'd share something I loved sometimes and get a lukewarm response, and then immediately equated that to meaning something about me as a person. I didn't even have the confidence to go, I don't actually have a favourite, to be honest with you. I don't know why, because it's a very easy thing to say. So whenever I would give this fake answer, I would use this as data to contribute to this narrative I was building about myself. So then when nobody ever asked me to put a playlist on or asked for my recommendations, I would add to this data and take it as evidence. Evidence that my taste was wrong and that I was wrong and that I was boring. Luckily, I'm now far past that and I don't worry about this anymore. But here's the shadow work part. I wasn't just receiving that as evidence. I was looking for it. My brain had already decided the story was true and it was collecting proof. Again, confirmation bias, which I talked about in episode 6 in the context of the boring comment, but what I didn't say then was that the ground was already prepared long before that comment arrived. Someone else naming it just gave the narrative an external source, which then made it feel more real and more valid and much harder to dismiss. And I had to eventually confront the actual reason things were the way they were and why I felt the way they did, particularly in uni. And one example is that I didn't join societies or clubs at uni, other than like one, and even then I didn't give as much time as I could have. And I hadn't sought out my own communities and I hadn't put myself out there because I was absolutely petrified of rejection. And it was easier, much easier, to tell myself a story about why people weren't coming to me than to admit that I hadn't gone to them. I was displacing responsibility, looking for an external reason for something that was, at least in part, on me. And that was a really hard thing to admit because it meant the narrative I'd been living inside, the one that made me a passive victim of other people's indifference, wasn't entirely accurate. I had contributed to it, not by being boring, but by being so afraid of rejection that I'd removed myself from the situations where connection was even possible, and then used the absence of connection as proof that I was the problem. And that's the shadow in action. It doesn't stay hidden. It finds ways to confirm itself. It makes you look for the evidence. And sometimes it makes you behave in ways that create the very outcome you fear. Naming that was uncomfortable But it was also genuinely freeing, because if I contributed to it, I could also change it. And I think what connects all of these threads, the music, the boring narrative, the not putting myself out there, is this. I was living inside a set of self-imposed parameters without realising it. Parameters about how I should be perceived, how things should look, how experiences were supposed to feel. And because I was always measuring reality against some imagined version of it, ironically, something that's not even a reality, because I'd absorbed it from TV shows and films and other people's lives, I was never fully present in any of the memories I think back on now. Because I was in this perpetual state of seeking something and being disappointed when it didn't arrive. But I never facilitated the experiences I wanted to have. I was waiting for them to come to me, and it never did. And that's why the realisation in episode 3, no one is coming to do it for you, hit as hard as it did. Because it wasn't just about fitness or academic results. It was about everything. It was about finally understanding that the life I wanted required me to show up for it. And that waiting for it to happen to me was its own kind of shadow. A way of protecting myself from the risk of trying and failing, disguised as patience. And that brings me to what I think is the hardest part of shadow work. Not naming the thing, not even changing the thing, but choosing to take responsibility for it in the first place. Because you could notice the pattern and decide it's someone else's fault. You could name the belief and trace it back to your environment, your upbringing, your circumstances, all of which might be entirely true, and use that as the reason you don't have to change it. For me, the bullying made me this way. The culture I grew up in made me this way. And yes, those things are real and they contributed. But at some point, you also become the one holding the belief. You become the one choosing to act from it. And taking responsibility means accepting that regardless of where something came from, you are now the one who has to deal with it. And that's its own specific kind of hard. Separate from the noticing, separate from the changing, it's the moment between seeing something and deciding to own it. And some might never make it past that moment. Not because they're bad people, but because ownership is heavy, and choosing to carry it is a decision. Once you make that decision though, once you take responsibility, then comes the question of what you actually do with it. Do you keep this part of yourself, or do you do the work of changing it? And I want to be honest, as always, about what that actually means, because choosing to change a shadow belief doesn't mean it disappears. It means that every time it shows up, because it will keep showing up, you have to choose differently again and again and again. The white lies are a good example. I noticed the pattern, I named it, I understood where it came from, and I made a choice to stop. But that choice doesn't happen once. It happens in real time in specific moments, when the easier thing is to say what's comfortable rather than what's true. And every single time, I have to actively choose again. Some days I get it right, some days I don't. And on the days I don't, I have to take ownership of that too. Not spiral, not catastrophize, just look at it clearly and go, that was me, that was a choice I made, and I can make a different one next time. Choosing to be honest in hard conversations, not softening just because it's uncomfortable. Choosing to accept criticism rather than getting defensive because that criticism might be pointing at something I haven't noticed yet. Choosing to ask questions, which feels like admitting I don't already know, has always felt threatening. Asking questions meant not being impressive. It meant being seen not knowing something, and that felt dangerous, but I choose to ask questions. Despite all of that. All of these are choices I've had to make deliberately, repeatedly over time. And they've gotten easier. Not easy, just easier. And I think that's what building resilience actually looks like in practice. Not the absence of discomfort, but the gradual expansion of your capacity to sit with it and choose anyway. That's what taking ownership actually looks like. Not a grand declaration of self-improvement, just the quiet, ongoing work of catching yourself, admitting it, and trying again. And the admitting part is harder than it sounds, because admitting that you did something, or that you are something that you don't like, requires you to hold two things at once. The discomfort of seeing yourself clearly, and the self-compassion not to let that clarity become a verdict. Because you are not the pattern. You are the person who noticed it, and noticing it is always the harder, braver thing to do. So back to September 2023. I know I've been on a bit of a journey since then, but because everything I've talked about, the bullying, the heritage, the Wikipedia belief, the perfectly mid narrative, the boring story, it all fed into that shadow belief about fitness, that I'm not someone who exercises. It wasn't just about exercise. It was the same belief in a different context. And weirdly enough, the gym was where it finally came to a head. So I was walking somewhere one day thinking, okay, if I'm going to take fitness seriously, and this was after all of these appointments and body scans and whatnot, I was thinking, what do I need to do differently? What have I been doing that clearly doesn't work? And I just realised that, firstly, I need to start with body weight only. Not because that's lazy or weak, but because I need to actually learn the movements and build a mind-muscle connection and a real awareness of how my body was positioned and how it was moving and what I was doing, rather than just pushing through and hoping for the best, and also modifying in order to accommodate the shoulder injury. But starting wasn't the hard part. Staying was. And that's where something I'd been learning about completely changed my approach. Around the same time, I'd been watching a YouTuber who talked a lot about Atomic Habits by James Clear, the book that has gone absolutely viral worldwide. And it was the core idea that stuck with me. And it was this: consistency over intensity. That showing up at 20% repeatedly is more powerful than going at 100% once and burning out. Small, achievable wins create dopamine, which then reinforces the behaviour, which makes it easier to keep going. And I've actually read the book since then, and it genuinely helped me get control not just over my fitness habits, but over the skin picking I mentioned in episode 7 as well, but also over my need for perfectionism. So anyway, I started with body weight, and I paced myself. But it was genuinely hard. Not physically, but mentally. Because in previous years, I'd lifted heavier weights, and there was this part of me that wanted to rush and to prove that I was still that person and to get to that point again, and to prove that I was still capable and that I was still impressive. And I had to keep telling myself, that is not where you are right now, and that's okay. Just start here, where you are now, and build up. But I also needed to set a boundary, and that boundary was that I work out at home, in a room with a closed door, whether that's the bedroom or the living room, whatever, and I don't want anyone watching. I didn't like gyms. It took me ages to realise that I don't like going to a gym. Because I needed a space to fail privately, to be frustrated without an audience, and to almost cry when I can't get the last rep without feeling embarrassed about it, or to when I feel like I want to cry because I'm not doing the movement properly and I feel like I can't get it right. And this is, a bit of a digression, but I promise it relates. One of my favourite musicians talks about how when kids learn to play drums, they're not thinking about the rhythm or the pattern or whether they're doing it right. They're just going for it. They're in it. And this really stuck with me because that's what I needed to reclaim. The ability to just do something without monitoring how I looked doing it. And that actually connects directly back to episode 5, to be cringe is to be free. But also episode 6, the problem with being perceived. The shadow work was learning to remove the imaginary audience from my own head. And all of this, the body weight, the boundary, the permission to be a beginner, was shadow work in practice. Not the dramatic confrontation kind, the quiet, unglamorous, do it anyway kind. Which brings me to how I actually got here. For me, one of those tools has been literary and psychological frameworks. Not in a clinical or academic way, more like we all have a latent, instinctive understanding of basic physics. We can look at something and go, that's not going to work. For example, like you might look at a slanted surface and know that you can't put a round object on it because it will roll off. So you need to put that object on a flat surface. So it's just that very basic understanding, right? And for me, it's kind of similar with psychology. I think that I have a very peripheral, very fundamental understanding of certain psychological concepts. Ones that I've picked up from my English lit degree, from personal interest, and from just picking things up from various forms of media. And I can kind of apply them to my own emotional experience. I can look at a pattern and go, oh, that's confirmation bias, or that's projection, or that's a shame response, or that's come from that experience, or that's because you felt this way once. And I'm not diagnosing myself, I'm just recognizing shapes. Or if I don't, I research it and I look into it and I learn about it because I like learning new things. And it goes back to that whole affect labeling. I want to be able to name whatever it is that I'm thinking about or feeling. And that recognition, that ability to name what's happening, is one of the most useful things I've developed. Because once you have the shape of something, you can start to work with it. And here's the thing about developing that ability to recognize shapes. Once you have it, you can't really switch it off. It's a blessing and a curse. And that brings me to the part of shadow work that nobody really warns you about, and I've kind of touched on. But confronting the things you don't like about yourself is genuinely hard. Not just uncomfortable, but hard. Because it's not enough to notice the pattern. You have to take responsibility for it. You have to look at something and go, that was entirely on me. That wasn't someone else's fault. That wasn't my circumstances. That was a choice I made, a belief I held, or a habit I built. And sometimes admitting the thing is harder than actually working on it, because once you admit it, you have to own it. Because you can't unknow it. You can't go back to living as if it wasn't there, and as if it isn't there. As I've said before, I had to admit that I'd been telling small white lies for years. Not because of what was happening around me, but because I chose the path of least resistance over and over again. That was on me. And I had to admit that I'd been avoiding fitness, not because I wasn't an exercise person, but because I was afraid of being seen struggling. That was on me. I had to admit that I was overcommitting to so many things. All my hobbies, but also sometimes work, and also social life and fitness and all these different things. Not because I genuinely wanted to do it all simultaneously, but because I was still trying to be Wikipedia worthy, still trying to prove something to an imaginary audience. And that's the thing about shadow work. You're constantly taking responsibility, and it's exhausting and uncomfortable. And sometimes it might even make you feel like a bad person, even when you're not. Even when you're just someone who had beliefs that didn't serve you, and is trying to change them. But that's also the point. You can't change what you can't see, and you can't see something you haven't named. And that's why self-awareness sucks in this context specifically, because once you develop the ability to see the shadow, you can't unsee it. Every pattern, every belief, every habit that isn't serving you, it's visible now. And with visibility comes responsibility. You can't plead ignorance anymore. You just have to keep doing the work. The book I've just finished writing is a good example of this. It's taken me 6 years. I restarted it 3 times. I rewrote 1 chapter 2 or 3 times because I wasn't happy with it. I've had to go back and adjust things across 49 chapters, a prologue and an epilogue, because things changed as I wrote, and because it's a sequel, and sequels require you to go back. But the thing is, I also grew up with the phrase, do it once, do it right. And I know where it came from. It was primarily about homework, about not being careless, and about taking things seriously. And in a lot of contexts, it's great, it serves me brilliantly. But it doesn't account for creative work or a fitness journey. It doesn't account for the fact that sometimes you have to, as the quote goes, kill your darlings. You get rid of the thing that is good or is comfortable because it doesn't quite fit in with what you're doing. You know, that good writing requires going back, dismantling and starting again. And sometimes it's the same with fitness. You know, I had to go back, start from scratch, start with body weight and build up. It's learning that the first version of something isn't always the right version, and that doing it right sometimes means doing it more than once. The problem is that when I used to write, when I was a teenager, I'd write a chapter, not even proofread it and just publish it, because finishing felt more impressive than refining. Again, that Wikipedia belief sneaking its way in. But writing the book taught me something different. It taught me that sometimes the work requires you to stay with it longer than feels comfortable, to go back when everything in you wants to move forward, to choose the right thing over the impressive thing. And that's a form of shadow work too. Now, there are so many things that I could say, but this episode's Uncomfortably Honest is: I hate not being good at things, particularly in front of people. And I have spent years structuring my life around avoiding that feeling. Avoiding gyms, avoiding situations where I might be seen struggling, curating how I come across so that the struggling happens in private, and calling it self-awareness, when really it was just fear with a better vocabulary. And shadow work doesn't end. That's another thing nobody really tells you. It's not a course you complete or a box you tick. It's ongoing. There's always another layer, another belief you didn't know was there, another moment where something you thought you dealt with shows up in a different context. And I'm still confronting things now. The overcommitting, the perfectionism, the rigidity, you know, the phrase, do it once, do it right, that is great sometimes but trips me up everywhere else. The need to be extraordinary, the grief of a heritage that feels less visible than it used to, the bully's answer I've never fully sat with. These are things I'm actively working on, not things I've resolved. But the difference between now and before is that I can see them. I have language for them. And having language for something, whether that comes from a book, a degree, a therapy session, a tarot card, or just a conversation where someone finally says the thing out loud, that's where the work actually begins. I know I've covered a lot in this episode, but it all ties in. These have all been layers that lead to this overarching topic of shadow work, of confronting the hardest, darkest parts of yourself, and the choice of whether to work on them or not. So I'll leave you with one question. And as always, it's just something to sit with if it resonates. But do feel free to answer in the comments or send me a message. What's something you've been avoiding because you were afraid of being seen not being good at it? Don't forget to follow or subscribe to make sure you catch future episodes. It really means a lot to me. Thank you so much for listening. I'll see you in the next one. Bye!